In the past at the shows, I've done some sort of sitting around a table and some sort of beginner talks orienting you to reading a schematic. I was going to kind of take it to the next level here. So if you're brand new to schematic reading, this might be a little bit hard to get too much out of it. Hopefully you can still follow the discussion and see it as an inspiration. One of the things that really affected me and my desire to really understand schematics is I remember I was looking for an answer to some sort of question online, and I think it was on Pinside, and someone's answer to a question about a startup problem on a Bally Wizard started with, well, I don't have the game here in front of me, but looking at the schematic, here's the startup sequence. And it was this whole long discussion, and I thought, I want to be able to do that. So that's what kind of inspired me, and maybe you'll get a little bit of that out of today's talk. If you've been using schematics for a while, and you kind of struggle a little bit, or you're not always sure how to take best advantage of that, hopefully I'm going to give you a couple of good examples today. And if you're already an EM schematic expert, chime in, correct me, help me. We're all just here trying to learn more. So I'm fine with having people chime in as we go. I'm hoping to have time at the end for Q&A, but if your question is related to exactly what I'm talking about, the time to ask is right there. So don't hold off. We do have a microphone, so raise your hand and bring the microphone to you. We are recording the session, so while the recording will only have your question in your words if you get the microphone. Otherwise, I'll have to repeat and maybe not get it right. The way I prepared the talk today is with what I'm calling case studies. So since finding out I was going to do this talk over the course of the year, I've kept track of times that I thought it was an interesting case where I used a schematic to pinpoint the problem. So I've kept track. These are real life examples, and I'm going to share those with you today. There's also some EM theory of operations, ways that the game work that weren't really obvious to me as I was getting to learn the games. And I'm going to use schematics to show you that. I have a couple of embedded photos in my deck as well. And so we'll talk about relay lock-in switches and what the score motor is there for. Are people able to see, let me jump ahead a little bit, that slide? I have a couple of copies of my slides I can hand out if someone has a visual impairment or something, but I will talk through it all, so we're good?
Yeah.
All right. So I want to give people, if you're new to schematics, there's one slide, give you a couple of tips for what to do. Just dive in and use them. Do what you can. Some things are simpler. Some of the pieces of the schematic are easier, and just get comfortable using those. Practice. Talk to other people. One of the things that I like to do with a schematic, which is an easier part of the schematic, is look at what turns lamps on. You're trying to figure out how the game works and which features turn on lamps. It's an easier part of the schematic. You can get pretty comfortable with that. So that's kind of a good way to get started. And just one last tip. Schematics are really good for finding when something isn't happening. A coil isn't firing because some switch isn't closing. If your game is acting in a way that we think something's shorted, it's doing things it shouldn't be doing, schematics are a really hard way to find shorts. And sometimes you can get pointed a little bit in the right direction, but just keep that in mind depending on the problem you have, especially when you're starting out. It's not a great tool for finding shorts. All right, let me go into the first, what I'm calling a case study. A friend of a friend, I went to his house to fix a Gottlieb photo finish. It's a single-player 1961 game. And this was a game, I like to know kind of the history. Game's working perfectly, and you got people over, and they're playing the game, and they go to start a new game, and one of the score wheels won't reset. Okay, that's the backstory. So I get to the house, beautiful hardwood floors, game is up against the wall. First place I would go for a score wheel that's not resetting is to look at the score wheel. Hopefully you know EMs a little bit already, but there's a switch that has to be closed so that it will go to 0. But getting to the score rails on this game was not going to be that easy. be protecting his floor and moving the game and all of this. I thought, wait, let me start with the schematic and see what else it could be. So, on my screen, I can't read the whole schematic. I just wanted you to get a feel for where I'm going. So, the transformer is right here. So I'm leaving that in the blow-up that I'll show you. But that gives you kind of a bit of an orientation. Also, the other thing, in a general orientation, the lamps are all here. Like I said, the transformer's here. This is all the 110 volt part with the power plug. And the stuff that works when you're not in a game tends to be lower, things like part of the reset or starting a game, where all of this, I mean, the flippers are probably at the top. All of this is the stuff that's on while you're in the game. So this is all the stuff we need to look at for something that's when it's not resetting. And what you can see here, these coils represent the score reel, the coil in the score reel for it's pretty funny. Instead of calling it the ones unit, they call it the units unit. I thought that was kind of funny. A little hard to read here, it says tens unit and hundreds unit. The run-out switch is the one that is closed when the score reel is not showing 0. So that when you're in a reset cycle, you've got let me follow this back. You've got the score, the motor will be running, and we'll get deeper into the motor function later. But the motor is running, so this switch is opening and closing. If the D switch, if all these switches are closed on the D relay, I forgot to include the schematic here, the D is the reset relay, then the score wheels will run until they're showing 0. Well, the D relay is one that I can get to without pulling the game away from the wall. So I've got a little picture here. This is looking into the cabinet with the playfield up. So the reset bank is right here. If I remember right, the D relay was right in this area. I was able to flip up this assembly, look at those switches, realize that one of them was not closing anymore, adjust that switch, and the game was working again. Didn't have to pull it away from the wall, didn't have to get to the score reel. It was kind of a surprise for me, because I hadn't gotten that familiar with this game, to think, oh, there's just going to be this other switch, of course, that would be the one I could look at. That's okay. So that's the first case study. I guess, do people have questions about that? All right, let's get a microphone. Oh, I will repeat your question.
How can you tell on a schematic what state a switch should be in, open or closed at a particular state, before you start a game or after? Okay, so really good question about what state of the machine is represented in the schematic. I'm going to paraphrase the question. Right.
And I have a little bit of a it depends question. I think I've seen it documented on some schematics, and I'm kind of thinking, I'm not even sure it's right for this example that we're looking at right here. So I'd have to kind of think about that. But what I've seen documented is this. You have a working game that you have started a game, you've coined up, or you've hit the start button. The ball is in the shooter lane, and the power cord is unplugged. And the power cord unplugged is kind of an interesting one, because that's never a state your machine is really in. The hold coil that would be on all the time is going to be off. So I've seen that documented. It's hard to know that's definitely the way your schematic really looks. But because in this example, I'm expecting D is not tripped and those switches are not closed most of the time. It wouldn't make sense. Let me just think about this.
Yeah, there they are, closed.
They're closed when it's tripped.
Yeah, well, is it closed when it's tripped, or is it closed when it's not tripped? Is kind of the question. So, I can tell you on some schematics I've seen it documented, and that's what I've read, but I'm not not sure that's what I'm looking at here. And if there's time at the end, I have all these schematics that I can bring up in Adobe here, and we can zoom in and see if this one documents it. I think this one's going to be too old and it wouldn't have that for sure. It's a good question though, and actually, does someone else have another answer? The state of the machine that's captured in the schematic?
That's always the home state.
What would you call home?
Home is when the game is sitting, turned on.
But the start of a game, game over?
When the motor's in the home position.
Yeah, the motor's in the home position, but
Nothing else is happening.
That's a trip relay.
Doesn't matter.
What's the normal state of a trip relay?
Right there, it's closed.
but has the relay been
If that's
tripped?
not closed, your machine's not in home state. Does that make sense?
The question is, which is the home state for a trip relay? When it's tripped or when it's not tripped? I know, but I'm not talking about the switch. I'm not talking about the switch in the relay. I'm talking about the relay itself. On a bank of trip relays, which is the home state? When it's already set or when they are tripped?
So
When the relay trips, those switches move.
right, but there are a lot of games where when you start the game, the start relay trips, things happen, and at the end of reset, the bank is reset, and none of the relays are tripped. But sometimes, some of the relays are tripped when you've completed reset. I would imagine. I can't think of a particular game.
And it wouldn't be in
The microphone over here.
So I would suggest looking at the whole relay, and whatever it says on the schematic, think about, when you first turn on the game, does the hold relay appear to be open or closed? And then when you press the hold relay, does it make the playfield light up or not? Because sometimes the game doesn't light up until you do something like hit the left flipper button or something like that.
So for example, I looked at a schematic last night for, what game? I was working on Spanish Eyes. And the hold relay switches that need to be closed for the lamps to be on were documented in the schematic as normally open. So the hold relay that would be, or the lock relay that's on all the time when the game is not tilted. Anytime you're in a game, it would be on. They're documented in the schematic as normally open.
The Spanish Eyes is of that era that you have that on the schematics it's generally referred to, like you said.
Unplugged.
The game is reset, started, and the ball's in the shooter, and the game is then unplugged.
So you've seen the same thing you've seen the same thing I've said.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that said,
But I don't know how to explain what I'm looking at on this screen, because this looks like we're in the middle of reset. So I'm not sure, because
You need to go look at what trips the D relay to see what the normal state is.
it's down at the bottom.
That's on the motor reel. You gotta put your motor
So
reel
D
in.
is here, well, let's take a look. D is here, it won't trip unless it's not been tripped. T, I don't know. If there's time in the end, I'll pull this schematic up and we'll kind of scroll around. It just, it didn't scroll as quickly as I thought it was going to, so I don't want to get to that too soon.
Well, in my games, the hold relay is tripped by a piece of tape.
it's not on the schematics.
So you can't tilt your game. Nice. All right. And then I'm going to intersperse in between the case studies a little theory of operation. So when I was so this would be about relay lock-in switches. And this will make sense, hopefully, why I'm calling it that. I'm not even sure that's the real term. Why I'm calling it that about the end of the explanation. So, but when I started reading schematics, and there's some relay that, you want this coil to fire, what fires this coil? You can see different paths through the schematic, different combinations of switches, either together or separately, will fire this relay. And in a lot of cases, the switch that will turn on this relay is a switch on this relay. And I kept looking at that and I'm saying, that makes no sense. How would that ever be that this switch is going to be closed to fire the relay itself? Well, turns out it's never responsible for firing the relay unless it's misadjusted. I've seen some of that in the hall already. That switch is there so that when something else triggers the relay and it turns on, it will stay on until some other condition is met. So if you look at that part of the schematic, and I will put it on the screen, that switch that's part of that relay itself, look back, there's something else that's going to open at some point to break that circuit and allow that relay to turn off. Right? So you have so some of the relays in your game, they get fired momentarily and then they let go and you're done. But some of them, they turn on and they stay on for a while and then they let go. So the example I'm going to show you is about a score reel. So this is one that turns on, locks on for a very short period. I will have another theory of operation later, where it was one that will stay on a little longer. But this one is a score reel. So I'm sticking with the photo finish schematic, but you can see I'm going to zoom in on a different part of it. And I'm going to show you the M relay. And I did now include the index here. The M relay is the 10-point relay. Okay, so this is one of the scoring relays. They tend to be in the back box. And it's responsible for advancing a score reel, sounding a chime, doing a carryover to the next higher digit if it needs to be. Well, so it has all these things to do. But one of these things that'll you can see, there's all these things on the play field that are going to trigger the 10-point relay. There's also you see here, the 1-point relay, along with the 9 position of the 10. So this is the carryover, right? That's also going to trigger the 10. But what is this? 10 can't trigger itself. So once this relay is tripped, this switch is now closed, and this is documented. I got the line going on top of it. Sorry about that. On add 10's unit is closed by default. So that gets opened by the 10's reel being fired. And I've got a picture here. This is not actually out of a photo finish. This was some head for spare parts sitting in my garage. So we got a screw missing, we got some other stuff. But I wanted to showcase a few things. So first, this is a scoring relay out of a Gottlieb game. And you can see here, this wire runs to turn the coil on. Well, this wire here, this white with red, or maybe it's the other side. Probably white with red is the one that would actually trigger the relay. Okay? So, the voltage is applied here, it goes down the blue wire, and it'll turn on the coil. Because that then completes this switch, it'll close that switch. The other side of the switch is probably just raw power or power after the tilt relay or something like that. That's going to hold that on. And at the other end of this wire, actually the other end of this wire would be coming out of a switch on the score reel. Hopefully you've worked on a couple of machines until you recognize what I've taken a picture of. This is a score reel out in my hand. When the plunger is pulled in, sort of preparing, it actually advances the reel when it releases, but when it's pulled in, this switch right here that's closed right here, it will open. Oh man, I put the same picture in twice. Oops! Well, the second picture is supposed to show it pulled in, and it would open that switch. So this switch is the other part of this part of the schematic. So M turns on, stays on until you're done advancing the coil. So I had a game in the hall yesterday that the 100-point relay would turn on and it would just stick on. And upon inspection, we actually found the switch on that relay that's actually responsible for advancing the score reel was not closing all the way. So the relay was turning on, it was never advancing the reel, so the score reel end of stroke switch was never opening, the relay was never turning off, and when I got to the game, it was actually had a blown fuse. I'm assuming it was that, though it hadn't burnt the coil up, so not sure if it got bad enough that it blew the fuse or if that was not even the cause for that, but so that is a relay lock-in switch. showed you with a schematic. I showed you some pictures and I included the wrong one. But that was our first theory of operation. Questions on that one? All right. Second case study. Valley Fireball. It's a 4-player game. And what this game was doing, let's see. All right. So if you played a 1-player game, everything worked fine. If you tried to play, say, a 3-player game, all 3 players would get to play ball 1. But when you drained player 3 ball 1, it said player 3 is still up and now it's ball 2. When you drain that ball, player 3 is still up and it's time for ball 3, or so forth. So again, the idea here is know how the game works, look at what works and what doesn't work, and use the schematic to sort of pinpoint where your problem is. So you need to know a little bit about how Valley does multiplayer games. And I'm just going to talk for a while here. I don't have a whole lot of pictures for it, but hopefully I can describe this enough. Your EM machines are full of stepper units. They're counters. And there are 3 counters in the game that control the ball up and the players. There's one stepper unit called the coin unit for how many players have coined up. That's the one that knows whether you're playing a 1-player game or 2 or 3-player game. There's a second counter for the ball count unit. Are you on ball 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? And then there's a player up unit, which is who's currently up. So which player light is on, when a score thing is hit, whose score reels are going to get advanced, and so forth. So those 3 work in combination, so that I'm saying it here, when player 1 drains the ball, the player up unit needs to advance to the next player. If the last player drains the ball, then you advance the ball count unit, you reset the player up unit, and now you start the second ball. Okay? So that's how it's supposed to work. And we got our Valley schematic, and we're going to zoom in. And let's talk for a while here. So let me get what I want to say here. So what was not happening at the end of the last player's ball was the player up unit was not resetting and going back to player 1. So player up unit reset solenoid. This is the coil that's not firing. Now, with the objective of not looking at every single path and checking every switch, I want to know sort of what's working and what's not working. You see there's a branch here. So what I was able to determine is, if I start a new game on this, it does reset the player up unit. This coil works, and all the switches over here work. Right? So my problem's not over here, my problem is not the coil itself. I know that part's working. The other thing I know, so now I'm following this path, right? And there's another branch here. This is a make-break switch. So I'm curious about all of this stuff down here, right? Well, the other thing that was working was the player up unit was stepping up. Remember when player 1 drained ball 1, it went to player 2. And they played their ball, and it went to player 3, and they played their ball. So I also know all of this is working. So if everything over here is working and everything over here is working, that switch is the thing that's not working. So, you step back and you kind of figure out what's going on, and then you go look at that switch and it wasn't closing, or I cleaned it or something. I can't remember exactly. But it really was, this one switch is causing all that problem. But, what fires this coil? Well, there's all kinds of stuff to look at. But I didn't look at any of this. I looked at behavior, and then I just went and looked at that switch and I fixed it. I don't even think I have a picture. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah. Let's get the microphone up to you.
I'm kind of new at this, so bear with me.
Sure.
Well, why was it working for all the other players but not the fourth one?
Okay, so first I'm going to say I wasn't doing a my example I was talking about a 3-player game, but that's fine. It was stepping up to the next player. Okay, if we were playing a 4-player game, it would have gone to player 4, but it wouldn't have then gone back to player 1 at the end of player 4's ball.
Doesn't it reset each time a new player comes up?
So the player up unit resets at the end of the ball of the last player.
The very last player.
Well, right. So if in a 2-player game, player 1 would play their ball. Then the player up unit would step up. So it would go to player 2, and player 2 would play their ball. And when that ball drained, now I probably don't have quite enough schematic showing here, but when the ball drained on player 2, let's see, ball drained on player 2, somewhere in here, because the ball count was stepping up, and it's the ball count unit that actually has this sort of end of stroke switch, which fired the player reset relay. And the player reset relay is the thing that resets the player up unit. So, the ball was draining, it was advancing the ball count, which was causing this player reset relay to fire. And player reset relay, you can see this switch closes. So the ball release relay is fired because it's pushing the ball out. This switch is closed because we've done a reset. Third ball relay, I'd have to look at the rule set to see why is that a part of the equation. The fact is, because everything else was working, I was able to zoom in there. I'm trying to remember, your question was, what was happening why was it going to the next player?
Yeah, so...
And it's because the player up unit was correctly advancing. It should have done a reset when the highest coined in player drains the ball. And that is the thing that wasn't happening. Okay. So this is kind of highlighting one of the challenges in utilizing your schematic the best. If you don't, you need to know what does a working game normally do to get you through all these sequences. Because you need to have, my objective when I pulled out the schematic was, I know this isn't happening. So that's where understanding how the game works and knowing, for a Bally early 70s multiplayer game, the way those steppers work together and what happens when you drain the ball. And I use the schematic to understand that. But it's something I had to read all of it and kind of figure out how the flow works. But when you know that's how it works, then you can say, well, this thing didn't fire. What's causing that to not happen? And it could be that the coil is bad. It could be the wire is broken off somewhere or whatever. But where do you look? You've got this whole game full of stuff. You can look on the schematic and say, well, it's something in here. And then you've got, a dozen switches to look through. Or what I'm saying is you can test a few other things, and then you're looking at one switch. And hopefully that's it. And in this case, it was the case for me. All right. Next theory of operation, the score motor. A lot of times I got a game open, working on it, and people say, what's that for? So does everyone know the score motor, the thing that kind of turns in a, let's see, I think I include a picture here. In a Gottlieb game, you'll see something that looks like this. In a Bally game, it's more of a, it kind of turns this way. It has a whole bunch of switches across the top. So what's that there for? Sorry. So when in an electromechanical game, you have a relay, and the relay can fire, and it can do multiple things all at the same time. But it can't do a sequence of steps. The score motor allows you to do a sequence of steps. A favorite example I use, because it's so simple to look at, is 500 points. And I start when people say, this game can't score 500 points. It can score 100 points 5 times. How's it going to do that? Well, the score motor is going to be called into play for a sequence of 5 hits of the 100-point relay. And let's take a look at that. Switching to a new schematic, and we may get to a case study on this later, but we're going to look up in this part of the schematic, and we're looking at, let's see, well, I didn't even draw my circles, my square here, because 500-point rollover. So there are all these switches on the playfield that will score 500 points. Any one of those switches is going to activate the Y relay. And now, thinking back again to our earlier theory of operation, the lock-in switch, the Y relay will stay on until the score motor, until a switch on the score motor at 2B, there's a whole layer we can get into for talking about the score motor, is then opened. And so, on your score motor, here's 2, B is sort of this lower layer down here, and this part of your schematic is showing you the timing of the switches on the score motor. So in particular, and actually it is worth looking at, 2B, the state of the switches at 2B change at the very end of the motorcycle. The other switches we're going to talk about for this motor, this case, is 1A, and I know you can't read these, but you can see there's little 5 boxes there. So there are going to be 5 pulses of 1A between when the motor starts running and when 2B is triggered and releases Y. All right, now let's look at some more stuff on here. I know I included, here we go. The M relay, which, these are, okay, 100-point relay. So the M relay is triggered by things that score 100 points. And it actually holds itself on, we've talked about that. But it's also triggered by a switch on Y, along with a switch on motor 1A, which I've shown you will close or change state. In this case, it'll close 5 times before the Y relay is released. I have a long explanation. All that happens between hitting the 500 point and getting your 500 points. But does that kind of help people understand a little more about how you get those points? So let me, on the picture here, we've got the score motor. The B switches, actually, this is a stack 1A. And what I'm trying to show here, you see these little arrows that stick out on that bottom disc? There are, a Gottlieb score motor will turn 1/3 of the way around for a full cycle of the motor. And there are 15 of these little arrows on this notch, so it'll hit 5 of them. There's your 500 point, your 5 hits. And so it's going to close a switch here 5 times. Now, it closes that switch 5 times every time the motor turns. And it turns for all kinds of reasons. But unless the Y relay is triggered and this switch is also closed, it's not trying to score points at that same time. So that's the simple example of how the motor comes into play. When you start looking at the more complicated things your game has to get through, like reset or starting a new game, that's where there's a whole series of relays that are turning on and holding while the motor is doing some work. And it may hold for multiple cycles because other things are keeping it turned on while it's still trying to get through the reset cycle, for example. And finally, everything is in the state it needs to be. The switch that's holding that relay on is then opened and you're done. Questions about the score motor? All right. Am I keeping you guys, or is it working? You get it? Okay. Let's do another case study. This one was pretty recent. Hopefully I'll remember all the details if anything comes up. This one actually was kind of simple. I was kind of almost jumping to the answer, but I wanted to see on the schematic what was going on. So this was a Gottlieb Olympics. It's a 1962 single-player game. And this one is on location. It's been taking coins for years. And every now and then it acts up. And this time I get a call and it's acted up. You coin it and it won't start again. So I get there and, you're thinking, well, maybe there's just a blown fuse or something like that. And you get there and it's not a blown fuse because there are coils that are turning on the score motor. If you turn it, it turns, does a cycle. So what's going on here? Well, what I noticed is the balls were being released. So this Olympics is one of those games where you have to push the ball push-up to get the ball into the shooter lane. And until you can really start a game, those balls aren't there where the push-up is. So the balls were getting to the push-up. I knew that coil was firing, but there were no flippers, nothing on the playfield would score. What's going on? So, again, we'll go into the Olympic schematic. And again, you'll see in the bottom corner of the schematic, I included the transformer to give you a little bit of context where we're at, looking at the schematic. So, here we are. And what's going on in this game is all this stuff down here is the stuff that happens during reset. And everything above this switch, and maybe I'll talk a little bit more about these. Everything up here, up above the screen, well, that's all the score, that's all the flippers and the scoring switches on the playfield, all the other stuff is above that. So here's a key thing to know when you're looking at a schematic. The switch, and Gottlieb orients this way, and the other manufacturers kind of turn these things on a side. But if you're reading from, let's say, if you're reading from right to left, you're finding all the switches that need to be closed to activate a coil. And you can do that across each of the different rows to see what triggers a coil. But when you've got switches along this vertical line, you're looking at switches that turn on large chunks of the game. They're things like tilt switches. So when you tilt the game and everything stops working, you've got a switch along this this vertical line that's controlling all that. And it's always kind of interesting to me when I was kind of understanding how the games work more. When you tilt and the ball's still on the playfield, the pop bumpers stop working, the flippers don't work, but there are certain things that still have to work. And you'll always find them in the schematic down low. I don't think there's any on this game, but the saucer kicker has to work even when you've tilted. And just think about that. Think about the first person who tried to put in a saucer. They didn't think that through, and they got it wrong, and then they're changing it. I love thinking about stuff like that, because I'm not sure I would have thought of it at first. All right, so I'm at this Olympics game. Clearly, the score motor works. I start a game, but I can't really play the game. I'm looking along this column, and right here I see the switch that needs to be closed to do the ball release. And I know that's working. But at the end of reset, it should then change state, release this, though it's held on until you actually score something. And that's over here. But this switch was not closing. And as I investigated and looked, this is on a picture here. This is on the trip bank. It was actually back down in this area. As I looked at those switches, I tug on the wire and the wire just comes right off. It looked like it was in place, but the solder joint had just gone bad over all the years and it came right off, soldered on, it was working again. But what I liked it as an example is, again, you observe behavior and you're not observing the behavior of, it won't start. You're actually observing the behavior of, well, all this stuff actually did happen, but then the rest of the game still wouldn't work. And that tells me to look, along this column, and then I was able to just pinpoint it right in there, almost right away. Questions on that? All right.
Talk about the balance between how much time do you spend trying to figure out exactly what switch it is versus just finding likely suspects and diving into the game. If you know that some part of a coil is not firing and there's like 3 or 4 or 5 different things that can fire it, do you spend time trying to figure out which exact problem it is, or do you just go and look at all 5?
So what I tried to come up with for this presentation, and what I took notes on through the year was, when did the schematic and that whole thought process really help? There are a lot of times where, there are 4 switches that are going to make something happen, and you got to check all 4 of them, because you don't know which one is the problem. But I do like the question because, I'm going to have 4 switches to look at for whatever reason. Well, one of them is on the score motor, and let's just, unless you've dealt with score motors, some of the switches are easier to see than others. So you get a switch on 2B, it's buried under all these other switches, you can't see it. I'm going to check that one last. You got a switch that's on the play field that's easy to see, I'm right there, I'm going to check those first. Switches in the head, I might check those second to last, or I might check them before the motor, it depends. I've learned now how I can really kind of get my flashlight in there and see most of what I need to see. But, so I'm kind of highlighting here where you can use a lot of logic and looking at what else is working and not working to pinpoint it. But yeah, there are times when you need 4 switches to go, and you got to look at all 4 switches. And at that point, you really, you're picking your battle, which ones are easier to get to, and it's always the last one. Any other questions? Did that answer your question? Did that kind of, okay. All right, let's see. We're doing okay on time. We're going to go into the fourth and last case study. This was one. I'll tell you the truth. The end result is, when I found the problem, I looked at the schematic and I went, oh, yeah, I should have found this faster, because it's pretty complicated. We'll see. But this was a game, so Gottlieb Outer Space is a 2-player game, and Gottlieb does multiplayer different than I talked about Bally. Gottlieb does multiplayer with just 2-steppers. There's sort of the equivalent of a coin unit for how many players have coined in, and actually on a 2-player game, this might even just be a second relay that turns on to say there's a second player playing. And then there's a player unit, and let me jump ahead a little bit, and I'll show you a picture of a player unit. This is around the back. It's back in the head, and it's this stepper unit. It's a continuous stepper. It doesn't reset. It just goes around and around. And you can sort of think of it as a ball count unit with 20 balls. There are 5 for each of 4 players. Now, I said this was a 2-player game. Well, I'm assuming it was to save money, but this unit is designed in a way that it's got sort of a dummy 3rd and 4th player. So when we're done here and you go play a Gottlieb multiplayer game, it's a good example out there. Surf Champ. Go play Surf Champ. Play a 1-player game, and when you drain the ball, you can hear the game go chunk, 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 chunk. Chunk, 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 chunk. At the end of the ball, chunk, 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 it's actually going to player 2 and 3 and 4 and then back to 1, and then it gives you your ball to play. So it's always counting 20 balls. It's just having you play the first ball, and then the fourth ball, and then, trying to do math in public, this is bad. But you get the idea of how that works. So this game, and so in addition to what looks like a stepper unit that you can see here, behind here are a series of switches. And so what I've done, I took this screw out, and I flipped this down, and now you can see kind of that whole series of switches. There's some plastic cams here that change these switch states as this disc turns around. And these switches have a nomenclature you'll see on the schematic. I'll point it out to you. And this was from that same parts game. Can someone tell me what's wrong with the game in that picture? A little bonus question. It jumped out at me when I was looking at it, but I don't know how easily it jumps out on the photo. No guesses?
Usually some colored discs that should be rocking against, right? I'm not seeing those in there.
Sometimes these are not all white, they could be red, but that's not it. It's sort of basic, but again, it might not jump out at you.
Is the plunger all the way fully engaged? Is that stuck?
Is this plunger stuck?
Yeah, I can't see it from here.
I can't either.
There is no plunger.
It looks like it's fully engaged.
You know, it might be fully engaged, but you're getting very close to what it was that I noticed. I popped this thing down, and it's got no coil stop. Or the nut that holds the coil stop in place has that post often breaks off. Yeah, so it's pretty funny. It's so funny. I go into this parts game to take some pictures, and I'm like, oh, that doesn't look right. That doesn't look right. All right, so let's see. Let's get into what's going on here. So this was a game. It was one of 3 that I brought to an event. So I had just gone through getting all these games ready. You bring them out to the event. And, you know, in an event like this, if a game goes down, okay, we'll get to it when we can. You got 3 games there. They all have to work all the time. So what's going on? What happens with this game is, and first of all, also, you know, I fix this game in our shop. It's kind of cool and dry. You get to the event, and it's a hot, humid space. So I'm thinking, okay, switches that we're touching aren't necessarily touching now. All the metals of, you know, they've changed, they've expanded or not. Keep that in mind. The problem I have is you can play a 1-player game just fine, but if you play a 2-player game, when player 2 drains their ball, it just sits there. It doesn't advance the player unit or the ball count unit and then kick out player 1's ball. And I would have to go around the back, and I would just sort of hit the. I was you know, a human stepper unit actuator, because I'd advance it once, and then it would finish getting to player 1, and then we would finish the game. And in between people playing games, I would be looking at the schematic and trying to figure things out. But let's see. Oh, this is all the stuff I talked about. What I ended up finding, and here's the Gottlieb outer space schematic. This is the section we're going to look at. And what we've got here is the add player unit. So this is the step-up coil for what I was showing you here in the picture. The thing that's going to essentially go to the next ball or skip over a bunch of them to get to the next sort of valid ball. And now, sort of telling the story in hindsight, remember, I had no problem with a 1-player game, but I had a problem when the second player was playing. Well, once the second player is playing, their score reels aren't all showing 0 anymore. So, you know, we can follow this path back, and it turns out it's very unusual for the path to have to snake back, but it would be long, it would be wider than the schematic. So even though this seems to go straight back, what you're looking at here is mostly part of reset. And what actually happens during the game I'm not sure exactly how far back I have to go, but I'm either coming in this path or I'm coming in this path. I think I'm coming in down here, and P is, I think, add player unit. You're coming in this path and it's snaking back and forth, but if I'm not playing a two-player game, all the second player score reels are on 0, and all these switches actually are already closed. So if I'm playing a one-player game and all these are closed, everything works well. Now I play a two-player game and the player unit's not advancing. Well, you got two parallel paths here and here, and they're actually tied together. So, this switch sort of overrides player 1, and this switch sort of overrides player 2. And it turns out it was this switch that wasn't closed, and this is where I wanted to get into this picture. So, again, you're looking around the back side of the player unit. You've got 5 stacks of switches, P1, P2, P3, P4, P5. And if you remember, let's see, we're looking at P4E. Now it's really hard to see it here, but the lowest switch in this stack is A, B, C, D. Thankfully, E is the top one. So when I was troubleshooting this problem, now instead of advancing the player unit, I would go back behind the game and I would just touch that switch, close it, and the player unit would advance and we would continue on to the next ball, finish that game, and then I get back there with my switch adjusters and I close that, make that switch be closing. It was just barely not closing, just like my theory that the humidity and the temperature change is what really made the difference in having this game work in the shop and actually work at the beginning of the event and at some point get to where it wasn't going to work anymore. There's my fourth and last case study. Are there questions on that one? Otherwise, we're going to get into sort of regular Q&A, and what I was hoping to do here is kind of filter out questions really specific to someone's problem that maybe won't benefit everybody and we'll just take it offline, or people have more general questions, I'd love to take them, and hopefully it can help everyone in the room. Tom?
Yeah, my question's back on Valley, as I know them a little better. On their schematics, they show you the color wire, what the color of them. Does the schematic tell you what Jones pin is it going to, or which of the 3? Does it give you any key to that? And then the second question is, how much do you trust the colors of the wires from the schematic?
Okay.
Because I always go through and I can't trace it all down.
All right. So, wire color and trustworthiness of a schematic and Jones plug position.
So you could go to the right one.
Right. All right. So wire colors, it's an interesting question in a couple of ways. Let's see, Gottlieb schematics, I love reading Gottlieb schematics. I've gotten really comfortable with them. The wire color is always just right here in some sort of little abbreviation, green, white slate, yellow, green, and there's a dash versus a plus. The wires are all so old now, I can't tell the difference between whether it's what they would do when they dash or what they would do when they plus. Generally, when I'm looking for a wire color, I'm doing something like this. I'm going to, which switch on M is the one I'm looking for. In this case, it's the one that's wired straight to the coil. So it'd be, I know which one it is. But usually, here we go, L. So I'm looking at this switch on the L relay. Well, the L relay probably has, actually, it's right here. The L relay, I can see it on this screen better than that one. 7A. So the L relay, what you can't read here is 7A. A is a denomination for normally open switch. So the L relay, wherever it is in the game, has 7 switches on it that are normally open. The other stuff here, so you can have normally open switches, normally closed switches, or you could have make-break switches. There's documentation here of discs. So this F relay is I call it like a little mini stepper unit. So it's got some discs on it. So, which of the 7 switches am I looking at? Well, that's where I need to look for slate green, and so it's not obvious right here, and okay, yellow, blue, red. So you can follow, all of this stuff is going to be yellow, blue, red. It's a common wire, right? So now I'm looking for slate green and yellow, blue, red. Whether it's slate dash green or slate plus green probably isn't going to matter. I'm going to find that switch. Do I trust the wire colors? I do. The wire colors almost always are really what I see in the game. What gets weird is the colors you see that are documented as slate green in the head may be different than on the playfield. And it came out of different bundles of wires. You may actually have a game where the head came from one game and the body came from another one, and they've been stored differently. So if they're both slate green but they don't look exactly the same, they're still both slate green. So that's important to know. And a Jones plug, a different part of the answer for a Jones plug. When the Jones plug is plugged in, unless it is a sort of an adjustment plug, whether you're setting 3 or 5 ball or whether you're doing that, when you're plugging in a Jones plug to connect the head or something, the wire colors are always a continuation. So, people often color code the Jones plugs, and I've seen those wrong. Like they're color coded and it's wrong. So don't use the color coding, look at the wires. The wires should be a continuation, but recognize, there may be the odd one in there. The colors don't look like they match, but they're actually just coming off different spools or they've aged differently, right? Jones plugs in general. The schematics that I've shown you in almost all modern pinball machines, so anything from the 40s on, the modern pinball machines, the schematic is a logical diagram. It's not a wiring diagram. It doesn't show you where the Jones plugs are. It doesn't show you which switches are in the head versus on the playfield or on the bottom board or any of that. It doesn't show you here. So you got to be able to trace the wires. And wire colors, there's not just one slate green. It may be reused numerous times in this game. So when you're chasing a certain wire through a Jones plug and thinking my problem might be there, it may be a different slate green. And I'm always tempted to kind of use continuity to test that. You can have continuity between 2 different slate greens through all kinds of different stuff going on in your game. You could try measuring resistance and thinking, well, this wire should be about 4 feet long by the time I get here, and it should have a really low resistance, and if it's a higher resistance, it could be going through a coil or something like that. But it's better if you can sort of trace the wires or do shorter runs to look for it. And then you said, can you trust the schematic?
Well, I meant, you've answered it.
Oh, okay. Though I mean, trusting the schematic, I have had times when the schematic doesn't match the game. I assume the game is right. The game's right there in front of me. I got to make it work. There have been times that the schematic is either incomplete or wrong, and I get a lot of schematics that have been written on, and I don't trust that. Most of the people who've touched the game before me don't know what they're doing. Most of the people who wrote on the schematic don't know what they're doing. That's a better assumption than trying to. The schematic is more likely to be right than that someone who knew what they were doing wrote on it.
So I just wanted to truth check my assumptions about the score motor.
Okay.
We talked about that earlier because it's always been a component that mystifies me a little bit. So to take your example of the scoring 500 points, there's a lot of other stuff that all of those switches could do as those cams are rotating around. So I want to make sure I understand that. Is it true that the reason that all that other stuff doesn't happen is because the score motor has been activated by a condition that meets a specific state of, there's an open chain, there's a circuit that those signals will pass through, whereas all the other ones would then have a break someplace.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, but I'll restate it and make it a little more clear, and I'll give an example from yesterday. There's one switch on the motor. This is probably not true, but I'll say there's only one. There's one switch on the motor that acts by itself. On this one, I'm not going to be able to point to it, and I won't get it right. There's a switch on 1C. Actually, on the schematic, I might be able to show it. Do I have a motor showing on a zoomed-in schematic? Yes. Here's the motor on photo finish. It is activated by a series of different switches. Oh, here's that D example again. Remember we were trying to talk about the state of the machine? There is no chance that this switch is always closed, or the motor would run continuously. So this must be a very specific state that's captured here, and it seems like it's sort of in the middle of reset. It's a little weird. But any of these switches will make the motor turn, as well as these two in combination. This is not an intersection. In this particular schematic, a circle is an intersection, or that switch. All right? So any one of these. One of them is on the motor. This switch is responsible for making sure the motor only stops in its home position. It's called the motor run switch. So if you open a game and you turn the motor a little bit by hand, far enough to get that switch to close, it will run, in a Gottlieb machine, it'll run a third, that switch will open, and then it'll stop. Okay? So that switch clearly works by itself. You can walk into the game, if you can get your fingers in there and close just that switch, the motor will run. Now I'm going to say, every other switch on the motor needs something else in the game to have changed the switch state so that something happens. Now, I ran into a game in the hall during this show where every time the motor turned, I'm trying to make sure I get this right. I think this was the example. I would score some points. No, this was the wrong example. I had something weird going on in a game. I think every time the motor turned, it would add a ball. Or it was something really, it's like, there's no way it's supposed to add a ball every time the motor turns. And I had some switch that was stuck closed, that shouldn't be closed. And I had to find it. And I used the schematic. And on that particular game, one thing I didn't get into, and maybe this will be a talk I can do, is, okay, great. I found the switch on the schematic that I think is the problem. Where's the switch in the game? And there's some hints, but this was a game inside it's called Little Green Man. It's off again, unfortunately. But it's a rethemed Gulfstream. And it had some relays called 3-in-1 reset relay and special reset relay. Turns out they're under the playfield, way at the back, and it was the last place I looked because I was done looking when I got there. But I had sort of examined the whole game and I was just about ready to give up, though I never do. And there it was, and it had a stuck switch, and that's why I was doing it. So in a case like that, every time the motor turned, it was doing something it shouldn't do because another switch was closed. But in general, there's one switch on the motor that's going to do something by itself, and it's the one that returns the motor to home. Everything else requires something else to be closed. And now, we could scroll through a bunch of schematics. Motor switches here. So here's a motor switch. This also has to be closed. That has to be closed. And this is only closed during, I presume, startup. This motor switch, it's the thing that's doing all the resetting. But these switches are probably mostly open, except when you're doing a reset. Any other motor switches on here? We could go through a bunch of schematics, but yeah, something else has to be open.
Thank you.
I think we might have time for one more question.
Earlier you said that we're talking about finding things that are not working, and this doesn't really apply to short, so I want to throw it at you. Do you have a good way of finding a short?
So finding a short. The it depends on the behavior. I mean, if you're blowing the lamp circuit, you have to look at every socket. I mean, it's crazy to try and find a short like that. I did have a game. It was actually a Humpty Dumpty, so the very first flipper game, and it had some short in it that was on the coils. Though that game it shares the common between the lights and the coils, so it's like it could be almost anywhere, but I was focusing on the coil. Well, to the extent that I could do something like unplug the playfield and still be able to turn on the game and do certain things with it, like do a reset. Some games you can do a reset without the playfield, some you can't. But you can unplug the playfield and see if I'm still blowing my fuse. You can unplug the head and see if you can do anything, but maybe you could still do that. You can also unplug half the playfield. And I mean, you're going to get weird stuff going on, but if you can sort of isolate it, it helps. Then you can get to, well, all the coils probably have a black wire on the side of them, and it kind of hits this coil, and then that coil, and then that one, and then that one. You can pick a spot where you're going to break that chain, and you're doing half the playfield instead of the other half. And that's kind of, it's a process of sort of making the equation smaller, trying to find it. My Humpty Dumpty I think I got to where I was disconnecting not the common on the coils, but the other side of all the coils. And I finally found the one where, in this particular case, the coil had gotten sort of hot over time. It's just been firing a lot, and its sleeve was metal, and the windings were actually wound around the metal sleeve, and the stepper unit was common. So when the coil came in contact with the bracket, essentially, I had a dead short. And it took disconnecting every coil before I could find it, because the bracket being common was just crazy. All right, shall I cut, or do we want to do one more?
I have something to add that might be of interest to your audience. The very best description of the operation of the Gottlieb score motor is contained in the Gottlieb 1960 or 61 repair catalog. It's absolutely fabulous.
I'll tell you, it's probably similar to a document I have where they had like a service instruction guide or summary guide. And what's astounding about it is it's this document describing steppers, and it has no photos. And I'm kind of thinking, a million words is not worth a photo. I mean, describing I guess it's me standing here. I'm doing the same thing. I'm trying to describe this stuff without having all the great stuff to point at. But yeah, especially if you almost get it, and then you can get like an authoritative document like that, it really helps, and then it fills in all the gaps for you. So I got to wrap up. You got just one final comment?
Similar to that, there's an excellent book called Pinball Machine Maintenance, Pinball Resource Cells, and it breaks down all the different errors of all the different machines.
Oh.
It goes through.
Start your comment again in the beginning.
Yeah, the name of the book is, I don't know, what's the page? It's basic
Pinball Machine Maintenance by Hank the Jigger.
Yeah, that's the one.
Oh, yes, I know that book, yeah.
Yeah, it's an excellent guide for learning how to use the schematics, for understanding how everything operates.
I want to get the author's name on microphone. Is DeJager?
Hank.
H-E-N, Hank DeJager. Yeah, I did get that book. I haven't gotten all the way through it yet, but I kind of knew what was in there.
Thank you very much, David. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to talk to David in the back of the room.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.